So it's probably no secret to you that Brits love a proper moan. And when it comes to Americans, that's just kind of an endless buffet of things for them to grumble about. Most of it's just good natured banter, of course, but every now and then an American habit, phrase, or cultural quirk will have the British people quietly rolling their eyes and thinking, only in the States. They might not always say it out loud, but trust me, the silent judgment is alive and well from my experience anyway here in the UK. And here are just a few of the things that I've noticed that they just can't resist the side eyeing an American for. Referring to football as soccer. So few things make British people wince quite like hearing our beloved football being called soccer. Yes, they know the word technically started in England, but that's ancient history and no one really wants to dwell on that very much. These days, it's stamped with a big American flag, which basically makes it utterable here in the UK. And honestly, the audacity of calling it something different in this day and age, really, it doesn't add up. Calling a game played mostly with your hands football while the actual football gets demoted to soccer doesn't make any sense. And I kind of feel that, to be honest with you. What really tips British people over the edge is the confidence in which Americans declare their version is the real version of football. And most of the time, British people don't usually argue back because they know it's a lost cause, but inside they're absolutely fuming at that statement. The over enthusiastic customer service that Americans are used to and often expect. So if you step into a British store, you'll be left to your own devices. Usually you have to ask for help if you need it. No one's going to be jumping on you the minute you walk in. And I kind of like that, in all fairness. Across the Atlantic and in America, you're barely 2 feet inside the door when someone's chirping about your day and how everything is going and how can I personally escort you to the light bulb aisle to find the perfect light bulb for your job. British people tend to feel that this level of enthusiasm is almost intrusive and unsettling, where the unspoken rule here in the UK is simple. Everyone's just trying to survive the shop with as little interaction as possible. So when faced with all of that like forced cheer and small talk and awkward guided tour, the instinct for British people is please just let us browse in peace, and usually gives them a tendency to walk out of the store more so than stay in shop. So I'm not really used to it, but I can get used to it in all honesty, because I did not like the overzealous customer service in America, even though I was in customer service and I was kind of one of those people for a long time. But now I've definitely see how I would much rather go into the store and just do what I got to do. Please leave me alone. I will ask for help. I'm an adult. Thank you. Next is the American need to cheerlead everything. Now, living in the UK has made me realize just how over the top Americans can be about pretty much everything. While I do insist that the British people could use a little bit more of cheerleading for themselves and a little bit more just basking in a triumph of their own making, when we clap when planes land, yeah, that really seems ridiculous. Chanting endlessly at sports games, especially if it's the same chant over and over again with very little originality, or throwing around words like awesome and amazing for things that are just average, that really gets under British people's skin, I've found. Here in the UK, that kind of nonstop enthusiasm just doesn't fly. British people don't need pep rallies to get through a Tuesday. They're just perfectly content with things being just all right and average and low key. And to be fair, after a while, I do appreciate the charm of that understatement. And not everything needs to be a motivational speech or a huge moment in history. But I do think that the British could learn a little bit from Americans for some of those moments, not the moments in history. The big moments are pretty good about celebrating and acknowledging and marking the occasion. Seeing the little moments, like if you get a raise or a promotion or something like that, I think it's fair to celebrate that and put a little bit more effort into it from an American point of view. It doesn't have to be over the top in like a week-long celebration, but I think, singing happy birthday and having someone buy you a drink is probably a pretty good way to celebrate something, a milestone that you've made in another year, especially when you get to our age. The over the top or not so television news in America. After moving to the UK, it was really apparent to me just how much American news feels more like a reality television show instead. Um, the dramatic music and the big, graphics and the over the top presenters that get extremely passionate about something so simple. The anchors for American news TV stations just sound like they're narrating the end of the world all the time. And it's something really, really simple like, hey, Donald Trump got off a plane. It's the way it happens. They travel. Presidents of the United States and world leaders travel. It happens. They're okay. Over here in the UK, though, it's a lot less dramatic, which is very indicative of the two cultures overall, probably. But you have stations and anchors here that deliver the news with all of the energy of someone just reading out bus timetables. Sometimes they're a bit grumpy, sometimes they're a little bit dry, but overall they're oddly reassuring because it's not that they're unemotional and it's not that they're not willing to kind of push back on people or anything like that. It's just more that it's that British stiff upper lip approach to everything that extends into their news presentations. I feel like the bias in the States is absolutely overwhelming and very obvious when you go from one channel network news to another. And while there is bias in everything, obviously, and most people can't not put their personal bias in anything, it's just a lot more objective and a lot more realistic point of view into news here in the UK, in my opinion. And one channel in the US is on the left and one channel in the US is on the right. And you don't ever really get the full story unless you're going to search out independent media. And that's just not something you have to worry about as much here in the UK. You don't have to worry about dueling soap operas and trying to figure out what's actually happening. The weather report isn't a national crisis here in the UK, basically. The excessive obsession with large food portions. I know I tend to overeat, and that is kind of a cultural thing in America, that healthy food is really expensive and the unhealthy food tends to be a lot less expensive and a lot more accessible. Living here in the UK has made me see how American portion sizes are just insane in reality. So back in the States, a standard meal would be like, to feed a family of four, is giant plate stacked with food. You get an appetizer, a salad, a main, and a dessert, plus free refills on all of your drinks. And the drink sizes are like the size of a goldfish bowl. I mean, here in the UK, portions are just more sensible. They're manageable. And I feel like people actually finish their meals. And the whole doggy bag thing, I'm told exists here, but I've never encountered it personally, but I've never had to either. I finish my meal, I am completely full and satisfied, and I don't need anything else. It's a complete culture clash. The United States, boxing up leftovers and having them is part of the dining ritual. And then the UK, it feels like either you clear your plate or quietly admit defeat, basically. And I can't understand why Americans don't see that their approach to eating is just completely terrifying and basically a big neon sign saying, we want you to be unhealthy for an indefinite period of time. Love the portions here in the UK. The food here in the UK is outstanding, and I definitely wouldn't want to go back to the American way of eating for anything. Next is a hot button issue, one that of course needs to be added to the list as well. Guns. Living in the UK has completely reframed how I see America's relationship with guns. Now, I always was a proponent for gun control. I always thought that the Second Amendment is misused and misread because there is a passage, there is a sentence that says that it needs to be a well-regulated militia, meaning it's not a free-for-all. You can't just buy any gun anytime, anywhere. And back home, it felt normal to walk past a display of rifles at Walmart, aka Asda, while picking up a frozen pizza for dinner. And I never realized how weird it was until I moved to the UK and realized that that's not something that happens here. The UK has a very different idea about guns by far. There is a school shooting in Dunblane in the late 90s, I believe. And ever since then, there's been extremely strict gun laws. And the very idea and thought of that makes people from the United States think I'm describing some kind of dystopian movie that could never really actually exist. British people can't ever wrap their heads around the belief that carrying a gun somehow makes you safer. And the more and more time I spend here, the stranger it sounds to me too. In the UK, the general philosophy is simple: don't have guns. It seems to be working out pretty well, and I can't argue with that logic at all. I have felt much more safer here in the UK without the presence of guns on a regular basis than I ever did in the United States. And it's hard to explain to people who didn't grow up in that era, but it's not about guns being out and about in plain view everywhere in the United States. It's not even about crime being really high or anything like that in your local area. It's more about you. It's more about the anxiety that Americans live with every day, with sending their kids to school, with going to an event, or even a traffic stop or a, altercation in a parking lot. You just don't know if that person has a gun, and they could have it legally. It could just, all you need is one wrong move or one wrong comment or a fit of rage that you're not really thinking straight, and your whole life can change. And I like that I don't have to worry about that any longer. I wish more Americans would embrace that as their reality, because it's not dystopian. It's very, very plausible, and it's a much, much more comfortable way to live. So another thing that British people definitely judge and feel a bit smug about when it comes to Americans is how heritage is treated. So in the United States, it's practically a national pastime to claim an identity based on where your great grandparents or grandparents might have come from. And you'll proudly hear people say, I'm Irish or I'm German, even if they're like a second or third generation American and have never set foot in Ireland or Germany or even outside of Ohio. Over here in the UK, that kind of thing gets you a serious side eye. Having a distant ancestor from Cork doesn't actually make you Irish. It just means you've got Irish roots. And that's something to be proud of. And it's something that you can definitely talk about, but it doesn't make you that. And I know part of it from an American point of view, because we're such a melting pot, there's a lot of discrimination against certain groups. Pride is very important in order to not lose your heritage, right? And to not lose that lineage. But after living here in the UK, I can completely see why British people find the whole thing a bit ridiculous, because it does end up becoming a little bit more over the top. And I think that part of it is that there's no national identity as American first. And that might be actually a hindrance to the progress in the United States, in my opinion. Driving everywhere. This is another one that I say a lot, but it always bears repeating. You don't have to drive as much here in the UK, and I love that. But since moving here, I've realized how much Americans really do rely on cars, and how the whole infrastructure is set up to get you to buy an automobile, to get you to spend lots of money on driving in general, whether it's maintenance, whether it's gas, whether it's tolls, any of that kind of stuff. And how most people just will jump in the car and take a trip 5 minutes down the road to pick up some milk instead of taking a walk to go grab some milk. Walking isn't something that many Americans think about on a regular basis, unless it was some kind of exercise at the gym, which is kind of funny when you think about it. Here in the UK, though, walking to the shop or taking the bus is normal. Average, everyone does it. Kids going to school do it, and elderly people do it all the time. And I am definitely no exception. I've been living here. I love taking public transport. So much easier, so much less stressful. And I would take that over driving any single day. But the infrastructure is set up here in the UK where you can do that. And it's definitely not the case unless you're in a big city in the United States. The first time that I told someone from the US that I walked 20 minutes to get somewhere, or that I was walking to work every day, they were completely dumbfounded. I mean, you would have thought that I just did like a 10K marathon or something. And I get it, because I used to have that kind of mentality. But you just have to understand, Americans just they're not conducive to walking things are so far away from each other. And if they are close, we're so used to just jumping in the car when we need to go somewhere that it's not even a thought that you could actually walk. And people who walk instead of drive are usually seen as extremists in the United States. But I'm glad that that's not the case here, because I am embracing it and I absolutely love it. Next is the weird obsession with flags. So coming from the United States, moving to the UK has made me notice immediately that Brits have a ton of national pride, but they don't plaster the Union Jack on everything, and it's not flown everywhere. Back home, flags are just, I mean, they're a staple. You can't go down the street without seeing at least one American flag, and you definitely see them in most businesses. They're at all sporting events, they're at all concerts, they're at most, they're definitely at all, political offices and things like that. They're on bumper stickers, they're printed across outfits and hats. In the UK, the idea of someone strutting around head to toe in a Union Jack is so odd and kind of ridiculous. So I think it's definitely something that British people do feel a bit smug about. Like, why do you have to do that? We have national pride without having any of that. In the United States, the level of flag devotion feels normal when you're in that arena, when you're in that realm, and watching Brits treat their flag with quiet respect rather than full-blown fashion statements is refreshing, but also a little bit bewildering, because the patriotism is just more subtle and understated. And if you're coming from a place where our loud flag everywhere approach is normal, it almost feels excessive and over the top. And I kind of apologize now when people bring this up, because I know I was like that. I was very much like that, especially as the daughter of a veteran who took, the flag very, very seriously, overly seriously, in my personal opinion, but still very seriously. I was raised on that you have to respect the flag at all costs. And even when you're desecrating it, right? Even when it needs to be put to rest. We have an actual flag day in America where if the flag is too tattered and torn, we actually burn it on that day and lay it to rest. There's like an actual ceremony and everything set aside in America for that. Here, I've been to museums and estate homes and cathedrals where they have flags from like the 1200s that are tattered and torn, but they're still hung and flown with pride. So it just is a really good example, I think, of how we approach that symbol of our country. And at the end of the day, I think Americans need to realize that it is just a symbol. And it's not necessarily something that you need to pledge allegiance to, or you need to tout and show off every 5 seconds to show that you're American or show that you're proud to be American. I think that pride is something that comes within, and that Americans probably could do with a little bit more of that inward search rather than displaying it outwardly all the time. Not knowing how to drink properly. As an American living in the UK, the drinking culture is definitely different. In the US, we're used to ordering a beer and getting it in a plastic cup at a festival or a backyard barbecue, the whole red Solo cup thing. And seeing a pint served properly in a glass feels fancy and sophisticated and something that you would just do in an upscale place. Also, we tend to do a lot of shots and go very excessive with our drinking when it comes to drinking games and making sure that we are never walking around with an empty glass for any reason. But then there's British pub rules. A last call can be so early or midnight and just past dinner, basically. And while we're on the topic of drinking laws, I still can't wrap my head around this, that you can drive, you can vote, you can get married and own a gun and join the military at 18, but you can't legally have a beer until 21. Something that I have said on this channel as well, I disagree with. I think it doesn't make any sense. Over here in the UK, you can legally drink and purchase alcohol at 18. You can drink at 16 or 17 if you are in a restaurant setting and you're with adults and you're dining, and you even have a law where if you're 5 years old, you can have a drink, which is usually not necessarily done, but it is on the books. But when you think about it from that perspective and you see how the US treats drinking, and how it's so taboo and it's such a cultural thing that when you go to college or when you turn 21, the first thing people want to do when they turn 21 in America is get wasted, like almost hospitalized wasted. And it just doesn't make any sense. It's not conducive to a positive approach on drinking in any way. I don't think that you should be giving a 5-year-old any alcohol, in my opinion, but I also don't think that you should have to wait till you're 21 to have exposure to drinks, especially if everything else in your life you're allowed to purchase, consume, participate in when you're 18. That's totally my opinion. And I do think it needs to be revamped in the US. UK doesn't necessarily not have issues with drinking. There are people that have issues with drinking, but it's just not that kind of culture. There's not a lot of people that are just out to get wasted all the time like there typically is in America. And if they do, it's in a more controlled environment. They're not going to clubs and bars. There's not tons of people at the pub just getting wasted all the time. And there are some pubs that don't even do shots or hard alcohol. So you just have to realize that it might be more of an abundance in the UK, pubs in general, and access to liquor like at local stores and stuff than there are in the US, but it's not as frowned upon, it's not as taboo. And I think taking that whole point of view perspective out of it gives it a sense of it's not that big a deal. So we should just treat it like, as a right and as a personal freedom. And if someone goes overboard with that personal freedom, to act accordingly and leave it at that. So those are the things that I believe British people are definitely smug about when it comes to the American point of view on. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Stay safe, guys. Bye.